he's professor of philosophy at Warwick University. And his research is, among other things, on intellectual vices, post-truth, extremism, philosophy of terrorism. And he wrote two wonderful books that are relevant to our theme today. So one of them is Vices of the Mind, and the other is Conspiracy Theories. And today he will talk about disinformation, narratives, and radicalization. So great to have you, Quassim. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. So, can you just confirm that you're all happy with the slides as they are? Okay, good. So let's get down to it. I'm going to talk about something called RNGW, which stands for Russia New Generation Warfare. So I started to think about this in relation to this conference, because obviously this is a conference on disinformation, and disinformation is rather fundamental to RNGW. So my source for this is a recent, very, very good book by H.R. McMaster called Battlegrounds. So McMaster is a former US Army general, a very eminent historian of the Vietnam War, and bizarrely, also a national security advisor in the Trump administration. In this book, McMaster describes this phenomenon. So RNGW is a form of information warfare that combines disinformation, denial, and disruptive technologies. It's an exercise of soft power, essentially. And RNGW has been manifested in multiple different countries over the last few years in attempts to affect the outcome of the 2016 US presidential election, the Brexit vote, the 2017 French presidential election, and numerous other happenings in Europe and North America in the last few years. So the aim of RNGW, McMaster says, is not to make audiences believe something new, but to question just about everything that they heard. So that I think is going to be quite important in what I go on to say. So RNGW is essentially about, to coin a phrase, merchandising doubt, rather than instilling particular beliefs in its target audiences. And in the context of RNGW, conspiracy theories play a particularly significant role. So a lot of this form of information warfare involves the propagation of conspiracy theories of one sort or another. And this is how McMaster sees conspiracy theories. He says that they're designed to raise doubts over the reliability of reporting, as well as the value and effectiveness of democratic governance. Okay, so here are three lessons, I think, of McMaster's account of RNGW. The first thing to note is that disinformation in this account occurs in the context of information warfare and is part of a campaign of disinformation. So we're not just looking at individual bits of disinformation, but we're looking at disinformation as part of an overall campaign. Secondly, as I've just already said, RNGW is not primarily directed at inculcating specific beliefs in its target audience. It is rather an exercise in sowing mistrust of and antipathy towards established sources of information and democratic institutions. And the third thing to note about RNGW is that the disinformation that it promotes and circulates is what you might call strategic disinformation. This is disinformation with a strategic objective. And these strategic objectives are in turn both political and ideological. So in practice, RNGW has mainly been used to support pro-Russia parties and or far-right parties and movements, both in Western Europe and in North America. Now, the fact that RNGW has focused so much on promoting far-right ideas brings me to the issue of radicalization. So RNGW has intentionally contributed to the polarization of politics in Western democracies, and RNGW has been very much directed at fomenting extremism, particularly extremism of the far right and white supremacist variety. And by supporting the agenda of far right political parties, RNGW has contributed to the increasing radicalization of the right in Europe and North America. And you see this in North America recently with the radicalization of the Republican Party, the storming of the Capitol, and so on. I think it's perfectly appropriate to talk about radicalization in that context. We're not talking about Muslims. We're talking about the right, the white right in America, but has been radicalized and whose radicalization is one of the objectives of RNGW. And one of the key mechanisms of radicalization is promotion and acceptance of extremist narratives of one sort or another. So the disinformation that is circulated and promoted by RNGW all build up and are expressions of a broader political stroke ideological narrative. And the narrative is anti-democratic or authoritarian, if you prefer. It's anti-EU and it's anti-immigrant. They are the core components of the RNGW narrative. Now, one question that people sometimes ask is, well, when I talk about disinformation here, who is it that's doing it? Well, in the case of RNGW, the main source of disinformation is the GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence, of course, under the direction ultimately of President Putin. Okay, now, so that's the kind of non-philosophical introduction to the issue of disinformation. And I ultimately want to draw some philosophical lessons of what I've just been saying. But let's now get down to the actual philosophy. So here are three questions that I want to ask in this presentation. Because the first question is, I've talked, and McMaster talks a lot about disinformation. People talk a lot about disinformation, but what exactly is disinformation? How should we understand the idea of disinformation? So as I'm sure you all know, there are many analyses of information and disinformation and misinformation. So there's a question about what analysis we should accept. My second question is, what does RNGW tell us about how disinformation works? I mean, one thing I think it already tells us is that disinformation often works anyway as part of a disinformation strategy or a disinformation campaign. But does RNGW tell us anything else about how disinformation works? And the third question I want to address towards the end is, what is the most effective way of combating RNGW or indeed any other disinformation? So this is a kind of huge practical problem in those countries that are the targets of RNGW. What do we do about it? Is there anything that we can do about it? So that's the ultimate, and I think, deeply important practical question to which there is not, in fact, an obvious answer. All right, so let's start off with the idea of disinformation. So here's a kind of simple theory that you might start off with, just to kind of get the discussion going. Okay, so first of all, let's start off with the notion of information. Now, of course, there's a whole debate about how you should characterize information, and almost as many different theories of information as there are people who write about it. But I'm going to just take it for granted, for the purposes of this talk, that when you talk about information, at the very least, you're talking about something that represents some part of the world as being a certain way. So one of the implications of this is that you can have true information and you can have false information. That's contentious because there are some people who argue that if it's information, it can't be false. But I'm not going to accept that restriction. then according to this simple theory, if you want to know what misinformation is, so misinformation is simply inaccurate information. And the crucial point here is that the inaccuracy does not have to be intentional. So if you ask me the way to the train station and I give you the wrong directions, but without intending to mislead you, then I have misinformed you, but not intentionally. And then you have disinformation. So here's a simple theory of disinformation. Disinformation is simply inaccurate information that the source intends to mislead the recipient. So the key here is intention. So it's not disinformation unless it's intentionally misleading. Now that seems to be absolutely fine as far as RNGW is concerned, because RNGW is intentionally misleading inaccurate information. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. So here we have a kind of simple account of disinformation. Now, recently, someone who has challenged aspects of this account, very interestingly, is Don Fallis, in a really, I think, excellent paper published, in fact, in 2015, a paper called "What is Disinformation?" So I now want to just talk a bit about Fallis's account of disinformation. Okay, so first of all, he accepts what I've just said about information, right? So he thinks that information is basically something that has semantic or representational content. It can be true or it can be false. This is then how he characterizes misleading information. So misleading information, he says, is information that is likely to create false beliefs. Okay, now notice there's nothing here about anyone's intentions, right? So information is misleading as long as it's likely to create false beliefs. Okay, now one question that is raised by this is how likely must it be to create false beliefs? Very likely, somewhat likely, or something weaker than that, right? So that's a question that's left open by Fallis, and the significance of that will become clear in a minute. Second question raised by this characterization of misleading information is who must misleading information be likely to mislead? I mean, there's presumably a degree of audience relativity here, right? So information that is likely to mislead me might not be likely to mislead you, and vice versa. So that is a possibility that's left open. But in any case, that's the notion of misleading information. Okay, and with that in mind, we now arrive at Fallis's definition of disinformation. Right, so disinformation is misleading information that has the function of misleading someone, and it is no accident that the information is misleading. Okay, now let me just highlight two aspects of this. Okay, so if it's disinformation, then it's got to be misleading. That is to say, it's got to be likely to create false beliefs. So that's one element. Okay. The second key element of this definition is the notion of a function. So disinformation is misleading information that has the function of misleading someone. That is its function, its purpose, what it's for. And of course, that implies that when it does mislead, it's no accident that it does so, because that's its function. Now, the thing to emphasize here, the thing to notice here, is that unlike the simple theory that I started out with, there is no requirement here of intention, right? So misleading information, disinformation is misleading information that has a certain function, but there's nothing in this definition about anyone's intentions. Okay, and that in turn is a reflection of the fact that, according to Fallis, disinformation can acquire the function of misleading people in two different ways. Okay, so most forms of disinformation are indeed intentionally misleading. Right? So in many cases, disinformation is non-accidentally misleading because the source intends it to be misleading. So that's one type of disinformation. Right? So I'm to call it type A disinformation. Okay, so that's your RNGW case. Right? So in the case of RNGW, it's non-accidentally misleading information because the source, so for example, Russian military intelligence, intends it to be misleading. On the other hand, according to Fallis, there is another form of disinformation that is non-accidentally misleading, but not because of the intention to mislead, but rather because the source benefits from its being misleading. Now, that may well seem quite mysterious, right, given what I've just said, unless you read Fallis's paper. And I'll explain that notion of type B information, disinformation in a minute. But essentially, that's the distinction he draws, right? So the simple idea is that in the case of some disinformation, it's misleading because someone intends it to be so. And in the case of other disinformation, it's misleading not because someone intends it to be misleading. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so now let's go back to the example of RNGW. Okay, so one of the most notorious examples of RNGW was the attempt of the GRU to interfere in the 2017 French presidential election. The interference took multiple different forms. There was a whole strategy of interference, consisting of I'll read you a little bit from a report on this. There was a coordinated attempt to undermine Emmanuel Macron's candidacy with a disinformation campaign consisting of rumor, fake news, and even forged documents, a hack targeting computers of his campaign staff, and finally, a leak of stolen data, including 21,000 emails released just 2 days before the second round of the election. And the leak was promoted on Twitter by an army of trolls and fake accounts with the hashtag Macron leaks, which appeared in almost 500,000 tweets in 24 hours. And here are some examples of these tweets. Macron is a US agent backed by wealthy gay lobby. He's a stooge of Jewish financiers. Macron is Saudi Arabia's preferred candidate in the presidential election. So these are all examples of RNGW attempts to influence the outcome of the election in favor of the far-right candidate, Marine Le Pen. Now, in all of these cases, they are all examples of type A and indeed type B disinformation, right? So in the case of why think of these as type A disinformation? Because there was the intention to mislead. Why think of them as type B? Because these were forms of disinformation that were to the benefit of the source of that disinformation. Okay, so here are some issues that now arise about this analysis. So if you remember, Fallis says that disinformation must be likely to create false beliefs. But of course, in the case of in this particular example, the disinformation did not succeed. It failed to get people to believe the disinformation, and indeed, it seemingly failed to affect the result of the presidential election. So if you say that disinformation has got to be likely to create false beliefs, does the fact that in this case the disinformation was largely disbelieved show that it wasn't really disinformation? So that's one question that we need to address, and this really goes back to the issue of how likely does disinformation need to be to create false beliefs for it to count as disinformation? Okay, so if you think of the more outlandish, outrageous claims, President Macron is half lizard and half human. Right? Is that disinformation? Is it likely to mislead? Are people likely to believe it? So that's one issue. A second issue, which goes back to the McMaster quotation, is this: was the ultimate purpose of RNGW disinformation to cause the target audience to form false beliefs about Macron? Was that the purpose? Right. So did the people producing this stuff actually care whether people ended up believing that Macron was Saudi Arabia's preferred candidate or not? So McMaster's view is that they didn't really care. What they cared about was sowing mistrust in official sources of information rather than inducing specific beliefs. And lastly, there's the question: what is the significance of the fact that the claims about Macron did not, in fact, systematically benefit their source? So here are some responses to these questions. In fact, it was the intention to mislead and thereby to advance specific politico-ideological objectives that accounted for the status of RNGW disinformation as disinformation. Right? So this is really going back to the notion of an intention. Okay, so if there's a case for saying that if it's disinformation, it was because of the intention to mislead, not because there was a likelihood that it would mislead, a likelihood that it would create false beliefs. So this is really, in effect, saying that Fallis is too quick in getting rid of the intention to mislead requirement. As for the ultimate purpose of RNGW disinformation, I mean, the ultimate purpose was not to promote false beliefs, though the promotion of false beliefs was a means to the ultimate end, namely the ultimate end of sowing mistrust. And as for the benefit condition, whether or not RNGW ultimately benefited its source, it was intended to benefit its source. It was intended to benefit the Russian state. So this brings into focus the whole issue of intention. So why does Fallis think that intention to mislead isn't a requirement for disinformation? So the example that he uses to make his point is conspiracy theories. So he says many people who disseminate conspiracy theories believe that what they're saying is true. Right? Now, if that's the case, then that isn't going to count as disinformation if you think that disinformation requires the intention to mislead. But there's another way of dealing with this, dealing with this sort of conspiracy theory. Instead of dropping the intention to mislead requirement on disinformation, maybe we shouldn't call these conspiracy theories disinformation. Maybe we should just call them misinformation. So now you've actually got two different types of conspiracy theory, right? So you might have, the sincere Kennedy assassination conspiracy theorist, right, who sincerely believes what he's saying is true. Right? So that in that case, there is no intention to mislead. So on my account, it's not disinformation, it's just misinformation. On the other hand, you have conspiracy theories like, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, where there clearly is an intention to mislead, and that is going to count as disinformation. And so you've now got this difference between conspiracy theories that are mere misinformation and conspiracy theories that are disinformation. But the point about RNGW is that most of the conspiracy theories that it promotes are disinformation. There is the intention to mislead. Okay, so what should we do about all this? So what I've essentially said, just to kind of recap where we've got to, I've described the phenomenon of RNGW. I've explained in what sense RNGW involves disinformation, is a campaign of disinformation. And I've defended a view of disinformation on which disinformation does indeed require the intention to mislead. And one of the implications of that is that some of the things that Fallis wants to count as disinformation, I don't want to count as disinformation. Okay, so that's where we've got to so far. Okay, so now we come to the kind of core practical question, which is what do we do about RNGW? So here are some kind of standard things that people say about how to respond to this form of disinformation. So some of these are from McMaster and some are just around more generally. So some people say that well, what we should be doing is correcting disinformation and identifying its sources and motives. So if the story is going around that Macron is Saudi Arabia's preferred candidate, then somebody needs to get out there and say that he wasn't, or that there's a reason to think that he was Saudi Arabia's preferred candidate. So that's the sort of correction strategy. Then people say, well, what we need to do is to restore trust in trustworthy sources of information. So we need to restore trust in, you know, whoever it is, the BBC or the New York Times, or whoever you think is a trustworthy source of information. Then there's the idea that we need to develop defenses against disruptive technologies, so against, you know, bots and viruses and malware of various kinds. There's also the idea that we should impose economic and political costs on the sources of disinformation. So, for example, sanctions, another idea. And then lastly, we need to promote civility in public discourse. So this is a sort of thing that people say, right, about dealing with disinformation. Now, I want to say, being a pessimist about these matters, I don't think any of this is really going to work or is going to be effective on its own. So on the point about corrections, of course, there's this whole discussion of whether corrections backfire or not, the so-called backfire effect. And I believe it's controversial whether there is or isn't a backfire effect, but that's in any case one worry that you might have. But of course, the corrections are coming from precisely those sources whose trustworthiness RNGW is calling into question, right? So if it's the government or the mainstream media that are issuing these corrections, it's not entirely clear that this is going to be effective, given that it's the governments, Western governments and mainstream media that are the targets of these attempts to sow suspicion and mistrust. It's also hard, I think, to restore trust in institutions that are under constant attack. I mean, the problem with RNGW is that it's absolutely relentless, right? As people sometimes say, it's a fire hose of disinformation. And it's very easy to say, well, we need to restore trust in our institutions, but how do you do that, like, faced with this sort of barrage? And as for a greater civility in public discourse, well, that would be very nice, but you can't wish it into existence. I mean, how do you bring about civility in public discourse, particularly in a highly socialized media environment where social media tools like Twitter are really seemingly designed to create incivility and disagreement. So so we're stuck with the question, the practical question of kind of what do we do about all this? How do we deal with this problem? Now, it seems to me when you look at disinformation, you can look at disinformation from two perspectives. You can look at disinformation from the perspective of the purveyors or the producers of disinformation, and you can look at it from the perspective of the consumers or recipients of disinformation. Now, a lot of the McMaster stuff is really producer directed. Okay, so if you think that the disinformation is coming from the Russian state, then what you need to do is to create incentives for the Russian state to desist from these campaigns of disinformation. Okay, so that is the idea of dealing with the problem by tackling the producers, by making it economically and politically costly for the Russian state to continue doing this. Okay, so that's one approach. But the other approach, which I want to discuss here, is the approach of focusing on the recipients or the consumers of disinformation. So one question, a kind of really basic question that arises here is, why are the targets of disinformation campaigns receptive to RNGW disinformation? Right, so why are people receptive to the sort of stuff that the GRU puts out? And what can be done to make people less receptive? So I want to suggest that RNGW basically works by promoting a narrative, and that receptivity to RNGW disinformation implies and is underpinned by receptivity to that narrative. Okay, so the narrative, I've said, is essentially anti-democratic and anti-EU and anti-immigrant. right? So that's the narrative, right? And individual items of disinformation are received I think sympathetically by people who subscribe to that narrative. So that seems to imply that reducing receptivity to disinformation requires the undermining and dismantling of the underpinning narrative. Right? So you can't tackle individual pieces of disinformation simply by issuing rebuttals or corrections. That isn't going to get you anywhere. What you really need is to tackle the underlying narrative. Okay, so you need to directly tackle the anti-EU authoritarian anti-immigrant narrative. So how do you do that? How do you do that? What does one need to do that? And here I think we come to the real crux of the matter. So I think as philosophers, and in particular as philosophers interested in the topic of epistemic vice, there is a certain line of argument that's very tempting, and it's a line of argument that I've succumbed to numerous times in my writings, which is to say, the real problem with recipients of disinformation, the thing that makes them receptive to disinformation, is some combination of irrationality and epistemic vice. You know, so maybe people are gullible or have some other sort of epistemic vice that makes them peculiarly susceptible to disinformation. Or you might say that people believe this stuff because they're irrational. So you might call that a kind of psycho-epistemological account of receptivity to disinformation. Now, if that's the account of receptivity to disinformation that you go in for, then it looks as though the remedy is also going to be psycho-epistemological. Okay, so maybe what we need to do is to improve people's epistemic conduct, improve their epistemic characters, go in for education, and so on and so forth. Now, although this is a sort of thing that I kind of used to say, and at some moments still believe, it also seems to me to miss something kind of quite important. I think what it misses is that receptivity to disinformation based on these narratives that I've been describing is not just a matter of people's epistemic vices. It's not just a matter of their irrationality. It's rather, at least I think to some extent, a significant extent, a reflection of structural factors like wealth inequality, marginalization, and the political, economic, and social impacts of globalization. Right? So I think people are receptive to these messages. I mean, to put it crudely, right? So if you think of people who have been effectively the social and economic victims of globalization, people whose lives and incomes have been adversely affected by this, they are ripe targets for disinformation, not because they're irrational, not because they are epistemically vicious, but because they are being given a message that resonates with them, that the narrative they're being fed resonates with what people like to call their lived experience. Right, and that is a fundamental point about this. Right? If you think of the Brexit vote in the UK, it was very striking that the very strong support for Brexit came from the white working class in the north of England, precisely the areas of the country that had suffered long-term economic decline, a massive closure of factories and industry. Essentially political and economic marginalization. So there you had a kind of ready audience for the Brexit message, which I take to be another example of essentially RNGW. Now, if that's right, then you aren't going to solve the problem. You aren't going to cure people's receptivity to disinformation by promoting epistemic virtues, by promoting education, and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, those are all good things, and those are all things that we should do. But the ultimate remedy is not epistemological. The ultimate remedy is political, or if you prefer, even economic. RNGW disinformation, I think, will continue to be effective until and unless these structural issues, inequality, marginalization, globalization, until and unless these structural issues are addressed. And that is not an epistemological matter. That is a political matter. That is a political matter. So the story that I'm telling really is one in which, instead of thinking of disinformation as a kind of epistemological ill, or primarily as an epistemological ill, I think we need to think of disinformation as a strategy that has political objectives, political, ideological, and economic objectives. We need to think of receptivity to these messages, to these narratives, not in epistemological or psychological terms, but we need to think of it in political stroke economic terms. And if that's right, then the most effective kind of remedy for RNGW is an economic policy and a political policy that actually addresses these issues of marginalization, inequality, and globalization. If you can do that, it seems to me that you are going to end up with an electorate that is much less susceptible to RNGW and other forms of disinformation. So it's the politics, right? Ultimately, that's what I want to say. Okay, that's it. I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So the floor is open for questions. If you can put them in the chat, I can follow everyone. So Michael and then Christoph.
That was a great talk. Thank you. It seemed good to see you.
You too.
I just wanted to, I had two quick, one question or one point that I wanted to raise as sort of a question and an observation. First thing is just a small point about your note about phallus. I think there is a way, and this is in relation to your point that, well, it can't be quite right to say that misinformation or disinformation involve acts that are misleading in the sense in which they're likely to create false beliefs, because of course, as you write, as McMaster and you and I and other people pointed out, a lot of efforts to in propaganda and conspiracy is actually meant to get people to be confused and not know what not to believe. But it seems like phallus can modify there and say, well, really what he should have said is they're likely to cause people to not believe what is true. Yeah. Right. That's consistent with the confusion. So that's a small point, but it's in the early part of the argument could be more significant. And the other point I'd say, just in his defense, is that I think the idea that there's a misleading information that's a scalar notion. Things can be more or less misleading. So the fact that he doesn't have a cutoff here of how likely is actually, it seems to me, indicative of the fact that it's responsive to the actual data, which is that these concepts are scalar. So two small points. I don't think they affect your overall argument, but I think they're worth noting. The other point that I wanted to make was I would like you to talk a little bit more about the point at the end. I agree with you that a lot of the reason these narratives are effective is partly to do with political and economic conditions. But there's also another structural issue here, which you didn't mention, which is racism. Yeah. It seems to me that merely engaging in economic, just engaging in economic policy isn't, and I think you would agree with this, going to be, isn't going to sort of make racism magically go away. Obviously, you don't think that. It seems to me that racism is a structural issue. That's not a surprising claim. And it seems to me racism, and indeed some of the very quotes that you put up, the stories and the most famous ones, certainly in the United States, racism is a key part of the narrative that is being both sold, and it's a key element of so not just in the story that's told, but it's also there in the populace, and allowing them to find certain stories, certain narratives to be more plausible than they actually are. So just a few comments there. Thanks. It was a wonderful talk as always.
Thanks. So I basically agree with everything that you just said. So on the issue of race, absolutely right. That clearly is a fundamental structural factor. And indeed, if you look at the quotations about Macron, I mean, anti-Semitism was certainly part of that. The anti-immigrant narrative is essentially also very closely connected to race. So that was, I think, implicit in some of the things I was saying, but I think perhaps should be made more explicit. On the idea of likely to cause false beliefs, absolutely right. It's a scalar notion, and Fallis actually says in his paper that it's just in the nature of these things that it's very hard to specify a kind of cutoff. It does become interesting though when you consider. I mean, I was thinking about this this weird British guy called David Icke. I don't know if you've heard of him, right? So Icke is a sort of conspiracy theorist who has this idea that lots of the people who control the world are essentially reptiles in disguise, right? They're shaped something like that. Now, if you say, well, okay, so is Icke saying these things likely to produce false beliefs? I mean, it's kind of, well, what is the threshold there? It seems highly unlikely to produce false beliefs, and there is then a question about whether we should describe these statements as misleading or not, if the test for misleadingness is likelihood. But I'm not saying that it's a weakness of Fallis's account that it doesn't give us a cutoff point, because obviously there isn't. I mean, there isn't a clear cutoff point. On the first thing that you said about the difference between causing people to have false beliefs and causing them not to have true ones, that again I think is an amendment that Fallis should accept, and it would be an improvement to his account. I mean, one thing that I think, one question that Fallis raises that is interesting is the case of the conspiracy theorist who genuinely believes what he's saying, believes that it's important that he says these things because it's important, the truth is out there, and he wants us to know what the truth is. So certainly in that sort of case, Fallis wants to deal with it by saying, well, here it's disinformation because it still benefits its sources. So by that he means it benefits social media firms that want to increase the number of clicks by promoting these theories. But I want to say in that case, I don't really have the strong intuition that we should call these theories disinformation rather than misinformation. Thanks for. I think we're in agreement. That's it, basically.
Great. So next is Christoph.
Very interesting talk. So I was thinking about the receptivity of people, and I was also thinking in terms of this point you made about the narrative being the actual goal of the disinformation campaign, and thinking about it in terms of a campaign. And I was thinking, it seems to me a lot of times that might also be kind of a psychological benefit to individuals where they feel empowered. So it's not just that they feel like they know the truth and they want to seek the truth and stuff like that, but in a very perverse way, even though the ultimate narrative is kind of anti-democratic and goes against Western ideals, and that's what it's trying to undermine. On an individual level, it empowers people, and it gives them kind of an active role to seek the truth and to go against the mainstream. And so in a perverse way, it's not so much about how outlandish these beliefs are and how easy it is or how hard it is to fall for them. It's that it gives these people a sense of active participation and empowerment, and whether that plays a crucial role here.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think this is, in a way, what I was doing was maybe kind of overemphasizing one side of this, because the other side has always been overemphasized in discussion so far. So if you're looking at, receptivity to disinformation or susceptibility to disinformation, of course, there are many accounts that talk about the psychological factors that make people receptive to it. And among the psychological factors is the one that you mentioned, right? That people get seemingly get a kind of kick out of these narratives, because
but not just a kick. It's sort of it makes them believe that these absurd ideas allow them to exercise their democratic right of freedom of opinion, freedom of speech. So it has like a political dimension. It's not just psychological. Yeah.
Right. But, So I think, I mean, it seems to me that here what you really have is the psychological and the political kind of coming together, actually. And these are kind of two sides of the same coin. I mean, the idea of political empowerment, saying what we really think, going against the grain, giving the establishment a kicking. I mean, these are all things that are incredibly powerful, and that in a way, I think this just brings out how difficult the problem is. I mean, there is so much that the RNGW can really exploit, and it does so. It exploits all these different, political, psychological, economic, structural, racial. All of these factors are ripe for exploitation, and clearly, it's done incredibly effectively. And I think the question that the challenge that's posed by what you're saying and what I'm saying is that given how seductive all this stuff is, how on earth are we going to deal with it? Right? I mean, it is very difficult to come up with a real. I mean, it's very easy to come up with platitudes about people should be more critical and all that, but it doesn't really get you very far against something that's so potent.
Yeah.
Great. Next question from June.
Thanks. Hi there. I was also going to raise this point about empowerment and the idea that you're drawing attention to the sort of marginalization and impoverishment and so on, that makes people perhaps receptive to these sorts of different disinformation. The extent to which the narratives empower them does seem like an important factor, at least think of the Brexit example. But I was also thinking that in a constructive way, it also might be an important part of making more fine-grained your attention to the political solutions. That the solutions, when we're talking about political and structural solutions, that wouldn't be a matter then of just sort of top-down investment in various kinds of public services, but also might be promoting and facilitating the kind of bottom-up mutual aid societies. I had this in mind just because I don't know if you heard it. There was yesterday an extremely interesting episode of Today in Focus about what's gone wrong in Hartlepool and why it looks so bad for Labour there, and they were drawing attention to the kind of locally empowering networks of mutual aids that had emerged and suggesting that should be sort of where attention needs to be in rebuilding. So anyway, just a thought that the empowerment issue might sort of help to finesse the political proposals that you develop.
Yeah, no, I kind of completely agree with that. So if you think about the the potency of take back control in the Brexit debate, I mean, clearly there is a kind of story about empowerment that slogan is really a kind of appealing to, and it there's something real there. There is real disempowerment, actually, and take back control is particularly potent when addressed to people who actually genuinely feel disempowered, and they feel disempowered because they are disempowered, right? And they're disempowered for reasons that have to do with the political and economic structures. So if you think about, I mean, there's this book by Michael Lind called The New Class War about technocratic liberalism, as he calls it, and how this is really essentially disempowered large sections of the population and thereby made them very susceptible to messages of empowerment, which may or may not be bogus. So I think that the empowerment narrative is to address it, as you say, it isn't just a matter of kind of top-down counter messages. I mean, it is a matter of actually empowering people by actually producing economic and social reforms that are going to make people less susceptible to these messages by actually empowering them, and that I think is in line with what you're saying. So I agree with you. Yeah. Great.
Next question is from Alexandra.
Hi, Quassim. Thank you.
Hi.
Really interesting. So I sort of agree and disagree with you. So can I sort of formulate my disagreement? So I agree that a solution would be to deal with some of political problems we have, but that doesn't show, right? Even if a political solution is effective, does not show that we do not have an epistemic problem. Mm-hmm. I also agree that it's unlikely to be correct that the problem is that people who are from a certain kind of socioeconomic background are somehow more gullible or have a kind of, wrong psychology, right? I think that, that's also unlikely to be true, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that they just live in what T. Nguyen calls an hostile epistemic environment, right? So it seems to me that that's part of what is going on, that certain kind of hostile and epistemic environments have been created that target certain sectors of the population. Now, it could be, I think then if you see it that way, then I think it's an epistemic problem that might require certain epistemic solutions in part, but the epistemic solutions are not targeting the individuals, are targeting the epistemic environment. And so there could be, partially legal solutions about, the obligations of the media that are the vehicles through which all of this is diffused. So what I'm saying is there could be structural epistemic solutions, even if the political matters, to solve this problem, because we don't all live in the same epistemic environment.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, so when I was contrasting the political with the epistemic, I was understanding epistemic in a narrower sense than you're understanding it. So I was really thinking of epistemic as to do with individuals' epistemic character traits or something along those lines, right? So all I was really trying to emphasize is that while there may be some, there might be something going on there as well, that isn't really the thing to emphasize. So I was then emphasizing the political stroke economic structural factors. But as you just pointed out, there's something else that we could talk about, which is the epistemic environment. So here we're not talking about individual psychology, but we are talking about something epistemic, which is namely the epistemic environments in which people live, and that in turn may indeed have a significant impact on people's susceptibility to disinformation. So I wouldn't at all disagree with that. That seems to me to be a fundamental point. Although the question then arises as to, well, how do we account for the fact that people live in these hostile epistemic environments? And so if you're thinking about, well, the sense in which someone's epistemic environment is hostile, well, what would that consist in? Well, it would, for example, consist in the newspapers that they read, or the social media sites that they rely on for their news, and looking at the way that these things operate and the content that they promote, we would then be back in the realm of the political and the economic, right? Because the reason that these media companies operate in the way that they operate is because of the economic incentives to operate in that way. So we're still kind of broadly speaking now in the structural domain, and you're emphasizing the sort of epistemic dimension of that of the structural, and I'm emphasizing the politico-economic dimension, but we're still dealing with something structural. So it was really, I mean, it was really the sort of individual epistemology that I was. I mean, I say these things because of, in my own Vices book, there's a lot of stuff about people's individual epistemic failings, and I think I probably just didn't make enough of all this stuff that I'm talking about now. But you're absolutely right that there is this other thing that that is important, which is the epistemic environment.
That's great. So we have 5 minutes left technically, and we have 3 questions from Nadia, Jenny, and then Stefan. Oh, keep them short.
Thanks for the talk. I guess my question goes into a similar direction again, this structural point, and the point about the narratives, but my worry is a bit different, because I was wondering, because it seems to me that the narratives that people have gotten used to are ingrained in the way they see things, so that when we change reality and change the structures, it might be the case that the narratives are still working sort of implicitly in the way that people see things, so that so that even if things are getting better objectively, sort of, so to say, the narratives, because they have gotten used to them for such a long time, and because they're so similar, they're variants of old narratives that have been well known for ages, right? That it might be, we might still need much more emphasis on the individual level, even though I totally agree with the structure point. I think that's totally underrated. But I think we might need as much emphasis on the epistemic point, just because the narratives are so resistant, we might say.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I think you're absolutely right that there's the issue of the, as it were, the facts on the ground, and there's the issue of perception. So I think you're absolutely right to say that merely changing the facts on the ground isn't necessarily going to change people's perception. So you could have your structural reforms, you could reduce levels of inequality and so on, and still have people perceiving the world as they perceive it now, and that, of course, would need to be addressed. So the structural reform isn't going to be enough. But then the question is, how do you address this problem of misperception, right? So supposing you think of it as a sort of form of false consciousness, effectively, that would persist even after your reforms. Now, I just do not know actually how you would tackle tackle issues. My guess, this is just purely speculative, is that this misperception of false consciousness that you're describing is a kind of lagging indicator, right? That it's something that would persist even after the initial kind of structural reforms, but that in the long term, people's perceptions would ultimately be shifted by changes in the world, changes in reality. I mean, that might just be wishful thinking on my part. I mean, beyond that, I mean, well, I don't know what the answer. Do you have any ideas, Nadia? How would you deal with this problem?
I really don't know. I guess maybe in the end we would need the other conditions that you mentioned before that are usually on the table. So making people trust more, maybe diversity in the media. I guess that's a big thing in Germany now, having people's voices heard, or having people state their views, so that maybe that's something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question though.
Yeah, indeed. So we have a question from Jenny and then Stefan.
Okay, I'll try to be really quick. Super interesting stuff. I was wanting to ask about the likeliness to mislead, and thinking if there might be more likeliness to mislead available than you're saying, just because there's a great diversity of people in the audience. And there are people who believe David Icke about the lizards, right? And when you think about the deliberate micro-targeting of tiny segments of the population and the very narrow votes that have decided things of enormous consequence, I was thinking once you start distinguishing kinds of audience, you might get a lot of likeliness to mislead out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. So I think likeliness to mislead has got to be audience relative. And as I said, what is likely to mislead me might not be likely to mislead you, and vice versa. And of course, you know, the GRU knows this, right? It knows this perfectly well, which is why it goes in for micro targeting. And I mean, so if by looking at your social media feed, I discover that you're a fan of David Icke, I will draw certain conclusions about the likelihood of your being misled by some story rather than another, and will tailor my messages, you know, to you. So this is this is another illustration of how, you know, how sophisticated this strategy is, and how difficult it is to, you know, to tackle. So I think that's absolutely right. A fundamental point, actually.
Great. And the final question from Stefan.
Thanks. Yeah, Quassim, great talk. I just want to comment on what you said about the political structures and the people who are sort of left behind, and who then become susceptible to that sort of propaganda. I agree entirely with that. However, I don't think it's the whole story, because what that's overlooking is that Trump, for example, was overwhelmingly elected by rich Americans. If you look at income, the higher the income, the greater the share of Trump votes in both elections. And the same can be said for Brexit. A lot of Brexit voters are perfectly comfortable neighbors of mine in Somerset who own a large house. So this whole left behind thing is itself, to me, a very risky story, because it is itself a tool in making us think, oh my God, you know, we have to deal with inequality, which of course is true. But it is deflecting attention from the fact that the other side of the story are perfectly wealthy, highly privileged white males who see that their privilege is under attack, and who then, for that reason, become susceptible to anti-immigrant rhetoric and all that kind of stuff. And the reason I'm saying that is based on empirical evidence by Oliver Hall and colleagues have a great paper that came out in 2018 showing that in experiments. And so I think we have to look at both sides of the equation. And what is so pernicious, in my opinion, about the current situation is that you have, you know, that top echelon of privileged people joining forces with, you know, people who are being left behind. Each on their own wouldn't abolish democracy, but the two taken together are rerunning the 1930s in Germany. And so, but you know, which is concerning. But I think it's crucial not to lose sight of the fact that there are some very privileged people who are buying into all this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. I completely agree with it. I mean, you know, one of the things about this sort of disinformation that's so pernicious is it's essentially disinformation promoting the interests of far right parties, many of whom have economic agendas of tax cuts for the wealthy. So it's not that I mean, it's appealing to the sense of being left behind, perhaps, but it's not actually offering them a real solution to this. I mean, what they're being offered is something that's going to make the situation worse, not make the situation better.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are no other questions, we should thank once again Quassim for a wonderful, wonderful talk. And we will reconvene in 6 minutes.